March 23rd, 1943, 0400 hours. The high plateau east of El Guettar, Tunisia. General-Major Fritz Freiherr von Broich, commanding the German 10th Panzer Division, sits in his command car listening to his own tanks rolling into position around him. 50 serviceable panzers, roughly 6,000 men, a company of tank destroyers, and assault gun battery. The terrain ahead is open, the pre-dawn air cold and still, and von Broich has every reason to expect the next few hours will be a rout, because he has done this before. 5 weeks earlier, at Kasserine Pass, German forces had torn through American positions in a sequence of engagements that destroyed 183 American tanks, captured more than 3,000 American soldiers, and inflicted roughly 6,000 casualties on a force that had, by nearly every account from both sides, broken and run at almost every point of serious contact. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had described the Americans as inexperienced amateurs. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had expected the Tunisian campaign to end with the swastika flying over the capital. British officers in the line, including senior commanders who kept their assessment private rather than public, had concluded the Americans were hopelessly trained and led, and had taken to calling their new allies, without particular affection, our Italians. Now, at El Guettar, von Broich is looking across open ground at the same American formation he beat 5 weeks earlier. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, Terry Allen's men. He expects the same result. His own staff officers, reviewing the intelligence picture the night before, had found nothing in it to suggest otherwise. The same division, the same general area of operations, the same general who had presided over its defeat weeks earlier, still nominally in command. By every conventional measure available to a professional German staff, this was, if anything, an easier target than Kasserine had been. A shaken, recently defeated formation, presumably still absorbing replacements and repairing equipment, facing a veteran panzer division with genuine recent success behind it. What he gets is something else entirely. By 10 that morning, as the sun climbs over the plateau, his panzers have run into a minefield that had not been there 5 weeks before. His armor slows to clear it, comes under fire from carefully positioned anti-tank guns his own reconnaissance had missed entirely. American M10 tank destroyers of the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion engage from prepared positions. American artillery drops coordinated, concentrated fire onto his formation with a precision his scouts had not detected in advance. Within roughly 1 hour, 30 of his 50 tanks are burning in the open desert. By midday, the 10th Panzer Division is retreating from ground it had expected to own by lunch. Von Broich does not understand what has happened. Captured documents afterward confirm it was the same division, same numbered regiments, many of the same officers, the same shoulder patches, the same unit roles. The Big Red One he had beaten at Kasserine and the Big Red One he faced at El Guettar carried identical histories on paper. They were not the same army. This same pattern would recur in Sicily, in Italy, in Normandy, in the Ardennes. It became common enough that German officers in post-war interrogations conducted across the following years kept returning to a single word to describe it: unbegreiflich, incomprehensible. They had beaten an American unit 1 week and faced what they swore with genuine professional conviction was a different army the next. They could not identify where the speed of the transformation came from. They could not locate its source. Despite repeated, serious attempts, they could never replicate it. What von Broich was actually watching that March morning was neither luck nor accident. It was the first fully visible result of a system quietly assembled inside the United States Army over the preceding 15 years. A system German intelligence did not know existed, and that, once it reached full operating speed by 1944, would turn ordinary American infantry divisions into some of the fastest learning fighting organizations in the history of modern warfare. To understand why von Broich's tanks burned at El Guettar, and why Fritz Baverland's Panzer Lehr Division would be effectively destroyed in Normandy 18 months later by a mechanism its own commander could never quite name, requires going back first to something the Germans genuinely had that the Americans, in 1939, conspicuously did not, and then tracing what the Americans built instead, which the Germans, for reasons rooted deep in their own military culture, could never successfully copy. For most of the 20th century, ask any serious student of warfare Which army on earth excelled most at tactics? And the answer arrived without much hesitation. Not the Americans, not the British, the Germans. This was not propaganda. It was professional consensus, earned across more than 70 years of institutional refinement, stretching back to the Prussian military reforms of the 1860s. The German army had developed Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, which gave subordinate commanders genuine authority to adapt their specific methods to achieve a commander's stated intent without waiting for detailed instructions from above. It fielded, by common professional agreement, the finest non-commissioned officer corps in the world. Its field regulations were translated, studied, and assigned as required reading at West Point, at Sandhurst, at France's Saint-Cyr. Between 1939 and 1941, the Wehrmacht had defeated Poland in 5 weeks, France in the Low Countries in 6, the Balkans in under a month. Entire national armies surrendering to combined arms operations executed at a tempo their defenders simply could not process quickly enough to counter. The United States Army, by contrast, was barely an army at all. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, American ground forces numbered fewer than 200,000 men, ranked below Portugal's. Its infantry still drilled with equipment largely dating to the First World War. Its tactical doctrine, laid out in field manuals that had gone essentially unrevised for 2 decades, remained built around the trench warfare of 1918. Its armor doctrine assumed tanks would never seriously engage other tanks. Its air-ground coordination was, in the assessment of one contemporary observer, close to non-existent. When General George C. Marshall assumed the post of Chief of Staff in September 1939, he inherited a force most European professional officers privately regarded as something close to a joke. In 1941, the Army ran the largest peacetime maneuvers in its history, the Louisiana maneuvers, involving close to 500,000 men, and the results were, by any honest measure, a mess. Combined arms coordination broke down at nearly every level. Tank units repeatedly lost contact with supporting infantry. Artillery fell out of effective range. Radio discipline collapsed under pressure. Officers who had looked capable on paper visibly buckled under the strain of moving large, complex formations across genuinely difficult terrain. The maneuvers did not demonstrate that the American army was ready for war. They demonstrated precisely the opposite, in exhaustive and occasionally humiliating detail. And yet something happened during those maneuvers that would eventually matter considerably more than anyone present fully understood at the time. Marshall watched. So did his most important subordinates. What they took away from Louisiana was not primarily a list of tactical fixes to implement. It was a conclusion about process itself. The United States Army, they decided, could not realistically train the way European armies trained. It possessed no deep institutional memory to draw on, no century-long tradition of tactical excellence to inherit. What it could build instead, what it would in fact have to build, given the alternative was simply losing, was a mechanism for learning faster than any other army on earth. The system capable of taking the specific lessons one unit absorbed in one battle and feeding them into every other unit before that next battle arrived. In 1941, this remained little more than an idea, discussed in staff planning sessions with no operational proof it could actually function under combat conditions. In November 1942, Operation Torch, the American landing in North Africa, provided the idea's first genuine test, and the early results confirmed every low expectation German planners already held. By the time American forces reached Tunisia in early 1943, the specific weaknesses Marshall had watched surface at Louisiana were on full, costly display. American armor was dispersed rather than concentrated at the point of decision. Anti-tank doctrine was built around a weapon category, the dedicated tank destroyer, that assumed, somewhat optimistically, that an attacking enemy would cooperate by striking at predictable, prepared points. Infantry and tanks rarely coordinated effectively. Air support arrived slowly and poorly synchronized with ground operations. At the top of the American command structure in Tunisia sat Major General Lloyd Fredendall, a man who spent considerably more time inside his own elaborately constructed underground headquarters bunker than at the actual front, issuing orders in a personal slang so idiosyncratic that his own subordinates sometimes struggled to decode what he actually meant. On February 14, 1943, at Sidi Bouzid, the Germans attacked. The 1st Armored Division's Combat Command A was committed piecemeal rather than concentrated, and German anti-tank guns and panzers destroyed it in careful, methodical sequence. American forces lost more than 160 tanks in a single day. By February 19th, at Kasserine Pass itself, American positions had collapsed outright. By February 22nd, American forces had surrendered more ground in a single week than they would lose across any comparable week for the remainder of the entire war, the Battle of the Bulge included. Rommel assessed the engagement and concluded, in his own later writing, that the Americans had not yet learned their lessons. The British officers around him agreed. The other German commanders around him agreed. There was exactly one senior Allied officer who looked at Kasserine and drew a genuinely different conclusion: General Dwight D. Eisenhower. In a private letter to Marshall, written within days of the disaster, Eisenhower wrote that all of their people, from the very highest ranks to the very lowest, had learned that this was not a child's game. A few days later, in a separate letter, he added that they were learning something new every single day and that, in general, they were not making the same mistake twice. The Germans heard none of this private correspondence and had no particular reason to wait it even if they had. They had the direct evidence of their own eyes, an American force routed in the field. Their own historical experience told them that Green armies recovered slowly, if they recovered at all. The British had needed close to 3 years of accumulated defeat before their own army learned to reliably beat German forces in the field. The Soviets had spent 18 months paying catastrophic human cost for comparable lessons. The reasonable German assumption, as of February 23, 1943, was that the Americans would pay a similar price across a similar span of time. That assumption was wrong by March 23rd. And in the 35 days between those two dates, something happened inside the American army that German intelligence would spend the rest of the war trying and consistently failing to fully understand. What happened in those 35 days was not magic. It was machinery, a machinery of institutional learning that had been quietly assembled inside the United States since the middle of 1942, and that was now, for the first time, running at genuine operational speed against a live enemy. Start with the paper itself. On June 18, 1942, the War Department's Military Intelligence Service issued the first of a recurring bulletin series titled Tactical and Technical Trends. A new issue went out roughly every 2 weeks. Reports from American military attachés posted across every active theater of the war. Observations from officers embedded with British forces in North Africa and with Soviet forces on the Eastern Front. Technical analyses of captured German equipment. Translated excerpts from German and Japanese training manuals. Interview transcripts with Allied soldiers who had directly fought German units. 40 bulletins were published, running past 2,000 cumulative pages, all of it disseminated down through the Army's training establishment by the close of 1943. No other army fighting the war ran a comparable operation at this specific scale. German military intelligence produced its own summaries, but these remained tightly classified and narrowly distributed. British analytical efforts existed, but lacked the sheer printing and distribution infrastructure the American system could draw on. Soviet efforts, similarly, ran on a considerably narrower front. Then came the Combat Lessons pamphlet series. The first issue, published in early 1944 under the deliberately unglamorous title Rank and File in Combat, What They're Doing, How They Do It, was not a field manual and carried no general signature. It was a collection of short, specific, practical observations drawn directly from ordinary American soldiers recently returned from combat. A sergeant describing exactly how his squad had cleared a machine gun nest in Sicily. A tank commander explaining precisely why he had ordered a particular maneuver outside Salerno. A forward observer detailing a specific technique for adjusting artillery fire onto moving German armor. 9 issues appeared between 1944 and 1945, printed in enormous runs and distributed down to individual company level across every active theater. The Germans had nothing resembling this. German doctrinal tradition held that genuine tactical insight belonged to commanders by definition. The specific idea of asking a sergeant to explain his own battlefield improvisation, printing that explanation, and mailing it to every other sergeant in the entire army would have struck a German staff officer as something close to an inversion of how a professional military was supposed to actually function. Layered on top of both programs sat the Army Ground Forces Observer Board, officers dispatched personally by General Leslie J. McNair, commanding Army Ground Forces, with the specific assignment of riding alongside active combat units, recording what worked and what failed, and then flying directly back to the United States to brief replacement training centers in person. Hundreds of these reports were produced across the war. Report number 413 addressed defense against mortar fire. Report number 450 addressed Pathfinder team performance during Operation Market Garden. Report number 459 documented anti-tank weapons employment drawn from the 2nd Infantry Division's own combat experience. Every one of them fed directly back into the training pipeline running through Fort Benning, Fort Sill, Fort Knox, and Camp Blanding. Underneath all three programs ran the quieter, constant foundational layer of the entire system, the after-action report. Every American unit produced one following every significant engagement, not filed away and forgotten, but collected, analyzed, excerpted, and redistributed as raw material feeding the next revision of the next training cycle. The specific cycle time this machinery achieved was something no other army fighting the war had managed to replicate. A battle happened. Within days, survivors produced a written report. Within weeks, that report reached observers at a higher headquarters for analysis. Within roughly a month, its key observations were excerpted into a bulletin. Within 6 to 8 weeks, the bulletin reached a replacement training center somewhere in Texas or Georgia, and the training curriculum there changed in direct response. The next shipment of replacements, arriving at the front a few weeks after that, physically carried the specific lessons of the unit they were replacing. Lessons those replacements had never personally lived through, absorbed instead through a printed page and a revised drill. Return to Kasserine directly. Within 48 hours of the battle's conclusion, Eisenhower acted. Friedendahl was relieved. Major General George S. Patton took his place. Major General Ernest N. Harmon had already been quietly sent forward to 2nd Corps headquarters, what Eisenhower privately described as a useful senior assistant, carrying informal instructions to report back candidly on precisely what had broken. Brigadier General Lawrence Cooter arrived to systematize air-ground coordination under new procedures that would become standard doctrine for the remainder of the European War. Major General Omar Bradley arrived to report directly on the command failures that had contributed to the disaster and would remain on as Deputy Corps Commander. What distinguishes this specific personnel response from an ordinary wartime shakeup is the explicit instruction Eisenhower attached to it. Each man sent forward carried a mandate to document failure candidly rather than to assign blame quietly and move on, a distinction that mattered enormously for what happened to the resulting reports once they were written. The doctrinal lessons of Kasserine, meanwhile, were moving through the machinery at a pace the Germans would not have believed possible had anyone described it to them in advance. The dispersal of armor into small, isolated combat commands was identified as a central, correctable error. Anti-tank gun positioning doctrine was substantially revised. Minefield employment tightened considerably. Artillery fire control, already in principle moving toward centralization through the Fire Direction Center system Fort Sill had spent the 1930s developing, was pushed much closer to its actual design potential under live combat conditions. And critically, the 1st Infantry Division itself spent the intervening 5 weeks systematically reviewing every unit-level after-action report generated by the disaster and drilling the specific corrections directly into its own men. The Germans knew none of this was actively happening. They had their own intelligence picture, their own institutional assumptions about how quickly a Green Army could plausibly improve, their own well-earned confidence in the superiority of their own tactical tradition. By March 23, 1943, when von Breuil's tanks rolled forward at El Guettar, the 1st Infantry Division was demonstrably not the division that had been beaten at Kasserine. Not on paper, not in doctrine, and not inside the heads of the men manning the guns of the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion. A German intelligence summary from the period, recovered after the war, still listed the division's combat rating largely unchanged from its February assessment, the paperwork itself lagging weeks behind a reality no German source had yet observed directly. The specific question every senior German commander who encountered this pattern could never satisfactorily answer is the actual subject of this entire account. Where, precisely, had that transformation happened? What was the underlying mechanism? And why, despite repeated and genuinely serious German attempts, could that mechanism never be successfully replicated? To watch the machinery operate in close focus, follow a single division through a single 5-week stretch. The 1st Infantry Division, February 22nd through March 23rd, 1943. On February 22nd, as the German offensive at Kasserine finally exhausted itself, the Big Red One had been badly battered, but not destroyed. Its supporting infantry teams had absorbed serious casualties. Several attached artillery units had been overrun outright. The division's collective confidence was, by any honest account, genuinely shaken. Its commander, Major General Terry Allen, was a First World War veteran of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, a polo player, a cavalry officer by original training, a man who by every surviving account swore like an enlisted soldier and drank with matching enthusiasm. His assistant division commander, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of the former president, had landed at Arzew back on November 8, 1942, reportedly reciting Kipling from memory aboard the transport ship. Neither man's fundamental character was going to change over the following 5 weeks. What changed, comprehensively, was how their division actually fought. Within days of Kasserine's end, the division's artillery began systematically re-registering its batteries under the centralized fire direction center doctrine Fort Sill had refined through the 1930s, but that had never been fully applied under live combat pressure at Kasserine itself. Gun positions were relocated to provide genuine mutual support. Forward observers were pushed down to platoon level, drilled until using standardized map coordinates became close to automatic reflex rather than a deliberate, time-consuming calculation. Anti-tank gun positioning was overhauled entirely. At Kasserine, American anti-tank guns had frequently been sighted forward, exposed, and isolated from mutual support. The revised doctrine, absorbed partly from hard-won British experience against the same enemy, partly from the Americans' own first brutal lessons, called for guns positioned in depth, sighted specifically against likely German approach corridors, integrated directly with supporting minefields, a level of deliberate defensive planning that had simply not been a serious feature of the Kasserine defense at all. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with newly issued M10 tank destroyers, drilled its gunnery under conditions specifically designed to simulate the exact kind of concentrated German armored assault that had shredded American positions at Sidi Bouzid, practicing firing from defilade, shifting positions immediately after every simulated engagement, operating under direct forward observer direction rather than independent judgment. Air-ground coordination, badly absent through the critical fighting at Kasserine, tightened substantially under Cooter's new direct support procedures. Liaison officers embedded directly with ground units, request procedures simplified, response times measurably cut. Patton, for his part, did what Patton characteristically did. He arrived at 2nd Corps on March 6th and began relieving officers, citing soldiers found without helmets or proper uniform discipline, personally reviewing every unit under his new command with an intensity that became, almost immediately, the stuff of Third Army legend. His working relationship with Terry Allen was genuinely complicated. The two men argued frequently and openly, but Patton largely left the 1st Infantry Division alone operationally, because he recognized, correctly, exactly what Allen was already doing with it. On March 23rd at El Guettar, the 10th Panzer Division under von Broich attacked at dawn. German reconnaissance had reported the American defense as thin, and von Broich expected to break through to the town itself well before midday. What he actually encountered was a defense built systematically on every specific lesson absorbed since February 22nd. His column hit a minefield that stopped it cold. American forward observers called in artillery concentrations from gun positions that had already pre-registered precisely the corridors his armor was most likely to use. When his tanks attempted to bypass the minefield, they ran directly into the 601st's M10s, firing from defilade with the specific confidence of men who had drilled this exact scenario for 3 continuous weeks. Within roughly an hour of first contact, 30 of the 10th Panzer's 50 operational tanks were burning. American losses were real and significant. The 1st Infantry Division lost 22 of its own tanks, and the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion took heavy casualties of its own. But the German attack broke entirely. By noon, von Broich was pulling back. Rommel, by this point already reassigned and preparing to leave Africa permanently, reviewed the reports from El Guettar and later wrote that the Americans had fought brilliantly, adding, with a candor not always associated with his public reputation, that the Americans had compensated for their inexperience with considerably better and more plentiful equipment, and, in his specific phrase, tactically more flexible command. That particular phrase matters. Rommel had noticed, without quite being able to name the underlying mechanism producing it, that American forces at El Guettar were operating at a tempo they had simply not achieved at Kasserine 5 weeks earlier. Decisions were arriving faster. Units were coordinating with noticeably greater fluency. The gap between a field report reaching a command post and an operational response going back out had visibly shrunk. He did not know why. He could not see the machinery behind it. He could only see, and accurately describe, the result. What German assessments consistently missed was that the 1st Infantry Division at El Guettar had not become a stronger fighting formation because it had received better replacement personnel or superior new equipment. Its personnel rosters remained, in the main, unchanged from Kasserine. Its tanks remained, by direct technical comparison, inferior to the panzers arrayed against them. What had changed was the volume and velocity of information flowing continuously through the division's own operating system. The after-action reports from Sidi Bou Zid had been absorbed and acted on. The doctrinal lessons of Kasserine itself had been drilled into muscle memory. Observations passed down from British officers who had already fought Rommel for 2 full years had been studied and rehearsed. This was the first occasion in the entire war that the American learning machinery ran, fully and without interruption, in live combat. It would not be the last. Hans von Luck, a veteran German panzer officer who fought across France, North Africa, and Russia, later wrote in his own memoirs that the Americans adapted immediately to changing circumstances and fought with genuine, sustained tenacity. Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, chief of staff to 48th Panzer Corps in Russia, later a division commander in the West, put the observations somewhat differently in his own post-war writing, in a specific phrase he clearly intended as something other than a compliment. "They are masses," he wrote of the Americans, "and we are individuals." He was describing something entirely real. He simply drew the wrong conclusion from it. The masses he was describing were learning collectively through a system deliberately engineered to pump the observations of any individual soldier into every other soldier simultaneously. The individuals he privately admired were, by comparison, learning largely in isolation, because German military doctrine, and increasingly German political culture, had by this stage of the war stopped permitting honest field reporting to flow freely upward from the bottom of the chain of command. Jump ahead 15 months. Where the transformation from Kasserine to El Guettar had required 35 days, Normandy would compress the identical underlying process into 11. June 1944. The largest amphibious operation in military history puts close to 9 American infantry and armored divisions ashore across the first week of Operation Overlord. And almost immediately, those divisions collide with a terrain problem nobody had adequately anticipated in planning: the bocage. For centuries, Norman farmers had enclosed their fields with earthen banks topped by dense hedgerows, some banks running 10 feet high, some hedges functioning as effectively impenetrable walls of thorn and root, the enclosed fields themselves often only a few hundred yards across. German defenders had moved into this landscape with a doctrine built to exploit every inch of it. Every hedge concealed a potential machine gun position. Every field corner offered a potential anti-tank ambush. Every enclosed field functioned as a prepared killing ground. American tanks attempting to simply climb over a hedgerow exposed their thin belly armor directly to German Panzerfausts and anti-tank guns waiting on the far side. Their main guns pointed uselessly skyward at the exact moment they needed to be pointed at the enemy. American infantry casualties crossing these small, enclosed fields under continuous observed fire climbed to rates that genuinely alarmed the Allied High Command. Panzer Lehr Division, under Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, the best-equipped armored formation Germany still fielded in the West, was positioned to block the anticipated American breakout in the St. Lo sector. Bayerlein, who had previously served as Rommel's own Chief of Staff in North Africa, knew this specific terrain intimately, and knew his opponent from direct, extended experience. He expected American forces to grind through the bocage slowly, at heavy and sustained cost, over a period of weeks. The Americans arrived instead with a different answer entirely. It did not originate with a general, and it did not come down from a staff officer's planning table. It began with an informal conversation inside a 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron bivouac, where a small group of tankers were discussing, with mounting frustration, the specific problem the hedgerows presented. According to the account later documented by military historian Max Hastings, one of the men present, an enlisted soldier identified in the surviving record only as a Tennessee native named Roberts, made an offhand suggestion: why not weld saw teeth onto the front of a tank and simply cut straight through the hedge instead of trying to climb over it? Most of the men present treated the idea as a joke. One did not. Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, Jr., 29 years old, from Cranford, New Jersey, serving with the 102nd Cavalry attached to the 2nd Armored Division, went looking for scrap steel and found it in the form of Czech hedgehog beach obstacles, the German anti-landing devices that had been strewn across the Normandy coastline to stop the Allied invasion itself. He welded 4 tusk-like steel prongs directly onto the front of a light tank and tested the modification against a hedge. It worked. On July 14, 1944, Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding 7th Corps, came out personally to observe a demonstration. General Omar Bradley arrived shortly afterward. Bradley's own memoir records what he watched. The modified tank, fitted with a crossbar bearing 4 prongs, backed off, accelerated toward a hedgerow at roughly 10 miles an hour, and drove straight through it. A Sherman fitted with the identical modification duplicated the result immediately. Bradley later described the device as so absurdly simple that it had stymied an army for more than 5 weeks. Within hours, the Corps Ordnance Officer was on the radio to every ordnance unit in 1st Army. The order was continuous, round-the-clock production. Scrap metal was collected systematically from destroyed German beach obstacles up and down the invasion coastline. Welding crews worked through the night without pause. The clock started on July 14th. By July 25th, roughly 500 of the devices had been fabricated and installed. 3 of every 5 American tanks in 1st Army now carried what troops in the field had already started calling rhinos. 11 days, from one sergeant's improvised demonstration to standard equipment across an entire field army. Operation Cobra launched on the morning of July 25, 1944. Close to 1,800 American heavy bombers dropped a concentrated carpet of explosives directly onto Panzer Lehr's positions, and American armor moved forward immediately behind the bombardment, with Cullen's devices cutting clean gaps through hedgerows that Bayerlein's own defensive plan had assumed would instead channel attacking American armor directly into prepared German kill zones. Within hours, Panzer Lehr had lost the overwhelming majority of its combat effectiveness. Within 2 days, the German defensive line across that entire sector had ruptured completely. Bayerlein's own account of what happened to his division survives in a post-war interrogation transcript. He described the American bombardment as hell itself, the resulting front line as resembling a landscape of the moon, and estimated his own personnel losses at roughly 70%, dead, wounded, or reduced to a state he specifically described as numb. He then added a sentence that sits at the exact center of what this account is actually about. He had been genuinely certain, going into the fighting, that the bocage would hold American forces for weeks. Instead, they had arrived at his line carrying a solution he had never previously encountered, and they had arrived with it fitted to 3 of every 5 of their tanks. Bayerlein had served alongside Rommel in Africa. He had commanded elements of the Afrika Korps through its final battles there. He had personally watched the British require close to 3 years to learn how to reliably defeat German forces in the field. And he had now watched, in 11 days, an American army identify a specific terrain problem, invent a solution at the enlisted level, validate that solution under live testing, scale it across an entire field army, and deploy it directly against his own division. He could not explain how that sequence was possible. This is the second point in this account where a senior German commander independently reached for the identical word. The 10th Panzer Division had used it at Guettar. The Panzer Lehr Division was using it again at St. Lo. Between those two moments, 15 months apart, the American learning cycle had not slowed. It had accelerated substantially. The final question is the one German intelligence never successfully answered across the entire remainder of the war. Why couldn't they simply copy it? This was not, by any meaningful measure, a secret. Captured copies of the combat lessons pamphlets were sitting in German intelligence files by the summer of 1944. The existence of the Tactical and Technical Trends Bulletins was known. German liaison officers on the Eastern Front had observed something structurally similar, in rougher form, in Soviet combat reporting. By 1944, German staff officers could describe, with reasonable accuracy, the general outlines of what the American system was actually doing. They could still not build an equivalent version of it themselves, and the reason traces to 3 specific structural factors that ran considerably deeper than any question of printing capacity or distribution logistics. The first factor concerned whose observation was permitted to count at all. Inside the German military tradition, genuine tactical insight belonged, by definition, to commanders. The specific German term for what a genuinely capable officer possessed was Fingerspitzengefühl, literally, feeling in the fingertips, an intuitive sense for terrain and enemy intention. It was understood explicitly as a personal virtue belonging to the individual man, not as a product any institutional system could manufacture or transmit. When Mellenthin and other senior German officers discussed this quality after the war, they consistently reached for the language of individual genius. A capable commander perceived things his subordinates simply did not perceive. A capable sergeant executed that commander's intent faithfully. The specific idea that a 29-year-old sergeant from New Jersey might be the actual source of the single most consequential tactical innovation of the entire Normandy campaign, and that his name might appear in an official after-action record directly alongside a general's, sat entirely outside that inherited tradition. This was never a question of raw talent distribution between the two armies. It was a question of who was institutionally permitted to originate ideas worth recording at all. The second factor concerned what could be honestly reported upward through the chain of command without professional or personal risk. American after-action reports could state plainly, in writing, that a specific American attack had failed because of an identifiable tactical error, and that the error required correction in future training, and the report would simply be filed, read, and acted on, with no punitive consequence for the officer who wrote it. German reporting, particularly in the war's later years, operated under an entirely different set of political constraints. By 1944, Hitler had personally relieved or executed enough senior commanders specifically for delivering unwelcome factual assessments that honest field reporting had largely dried up at the highest levels of the chain of command. At the battalion level, German officers continued recording what they actually observed. Many of those individual records survive intact today, but the vertical circulation of unwelcome information into the broader training and doctrine system had been substantially and deliberately broken. Honest reporting was actively discouraged, and in some documented cases, directly punished. Honest reporting was, by direct contrast, the specific fuel that kept the entire American system running. The third factor concerns sheer institutional speed. American industrial capacity could print the combat lessons pamphlets in enormous runs and distribute them to every company in every active theater without meaningful delay. American transport infrastructure could move a single observer from a Belgian foxhole to a classroom at Fort Benning within roughly a week. American replacement training centers could revise their entire curriculum within days of new material arriving. By 1944, at precisely the moment the German army was beginning to lose the basic capacity to move paper and personnel efficiently across its own internal lines of communication, the American feedback loop was still measurably accelerating. Combine these three factors, and the answer becomes clear. The specific answer Fritz von Broich could never locate at El Guettar, and that Fritz Bayerlein could never locate at Saint-Lô. It was not that American soldiers were individually more intelligent. It was not that they were braver. It was certainly not the case that their tanks were technically superior to the Panthers and Tigers they repeatedly faced across the war. It was that the American Army had constructed a working system in which a single rifleman's observation from inside a Norman hedgerow in July could reach a training instructor in Georgia by September, reshape an entire training curriculum by October, and return to the front line embodied in a replacement soldier arriving by November. The identical loop repeating and accelerating continuously across 3 sustained years of war. By the time Panzer encountered it directly in Normandy, American infantry divisions were, by reasonable estimate, learning roughly 10 times faster than the opponents arrayed against them. Mellenthin's post-war verdict, offered as a pointed insult, turns out to have been, entirely by accident, the single most accurate description available of what he had actually witnessed. They were masses, and his own men were individuals. The masses had learned together, continuously, at scale. The individuals had learned alone. Circle back to the morning of March 23, 1943. On the high plateau east of El Guettar, Fritz von Broich sits in his command car. His tanks are already beginning to burn in the open desert in front of him. He cannot see it yet, and would not have believed it if told directly, but the broader war has already been substantially decided, not by the specific panzers on fire before his eyes, and not simply by the American infantry dug into the valley across from him. It is decided by a mechanism entirely invisible to him, a printing press running continuously in Washington, a training depot in Texas revising its curriculum on a 6-week cycle, a room at Fort Sill where artillery firing tables were being methodically rewritten based on the previous month's combat reports, a sergeant from a small New Jersey town who would not weld a single steel prong to a tank for another 16 months, but whose eventual improvisation would trace back to the exact same institutional habit already running at full speed on the Tunisian plateau that morning. Von Broich does not understand any of it. Neither, 18 months later, will Bayerlein. Neither will any of the capable, experienced German commanders who encounter this same pattern repeatedly across the remaining years of the war. They will spend the rest of the conflict fighting an opponent that is, in the most literal operational sense available, a genuinely different army every few weeks. The verdict this account arrives at is this: Germany did not lose the war against the Western Allies because its individual soldiers were worse, and not because its equipment was inferior. Unit for unit, man for man, German infantry and armor remained a formidable, professionally excellent fighting force into the war's final weeks. What Germany lost was the race of institutional adaptation. It had built its army around the conviction that battlefield excellence originated in individual genius, carefully cultivated across an entire professional career. The Americans built theirs around the conviction that excellence originated instead in a system deliberately engineered to convert every engagement, every documented failure, and every sergeant's improvised idea into usable training material for everyone else in the entire force, simultaneously. Across 3 sustained years, the system consistently outperformed the genius. Across 11 days in Normandy, it outperformed the genius considerably faster than that. Curtis Cullen received the Legion of Merit for what he built from salvaged German beach steel in a single afternoon. He lost his left foot to a landmine in the Hurtgen Forest 4 months later. He died in Greenwich Village in 1963, largely unremembered outside his own hometown of Cranford, New Jersey. The Tennessee soldier named Roberts, whose offhand joke had sparked the entire idea in the first place, disappears from the surviving historical record entirely. No further trace, no confirmed full name, no documented fate. Neither man appears in most standard histories of the campaign. Neither has a monument. The generals received their statues. The privates and sergeants who actually built the machinery those generals relied on, for the most part, did not. Though the machinery itself, quietly assembled from printing presses and training depots, and the simple institutional decision to let a sergeant's observation count for something, was arguably the single most consequential weapon either side fielded in the entire war.